Hidden histories. China. In other talks, I have explained that one of the great pleasures and joys and surprises of my life as a historian and anthropologist has been the discovery of the hidden history of certain civilizations. I talked about England and how I discovered that the Weberian Marxist idea of the great transformation from feudal peasantry to modernity was largely a myth. I talked about Japan and how the common view of almost all Japanese and others that Japan had become modern at the end of the 19th century and put away its medieval and earlier history was also a myth, and that there was a great continuity. And now I want to talk about the last case of this kind of revelation, which is in relation to China. My wife and I first went to China in 1996 and discovered a land and a vast civilization of 1.2 or 3 million people at that time, which was just opening up under the influence of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, and was still half in the earlier era of bicycles and blue costumes and old Soviet-style architecture, but there were signs of green shoots and change. And when we went back in 2002, it was well underway. There was a new airport, the cities were already being transformed. And as we went each year, almost every year until COVID, we discovered this bustling, extraordinary, huge change, one of the greatest changes in human history of an industrializing civilization, and certainly on that scale the greatest that's ever happened. And when we talked to the people, they said, well, yes, it's a new China. It's a new China in two major ways. One is the old China, the olds, as Mao Zedong used to call them, Confucianism, the old family system, the old imperial system. All those olds have been wiped away, and we are in a new social order. Also, the recent huge economic and social changes with westernization and liberalization in the market economy have meant that China is a new world. So there was the same impression as in Japan, except in Japan it had happened a century earlier. And people didn't really question that the continuity, the tree had been cut and it was a new tree. But there were, again, as in the other cases, there was a troubling contradiction between this view and the view that was you found in actual some historical sources, and particularly in literature, because on the one hand, young Chinese now and in the last 2 or 3 decades have been well educated, and they've been educated as before to a considerable extent in their classics, so they know quite a bit about Confucius and Mencius and Lao Tse and the great Tang poets and so on. And they feel close to them and a resonance, and it's remarkable when you talk to Chinese how often they'll say, well, as so-and-so said, and you'll say, well, who was so-and-so? And they said, oh, well, he was an ancient Qin philosopher, or 2,000 years ago. So the past and the present are interwoven in daily life in a remarkable way. And I think many Chinese sense that they are not separated from their great-grandparents and from the earlier period at least part of them feels that, and on the other hand, they're told constantly that no, it's all new, and we've started again. This was a contradiction I didn't really pick up until I'd been to China a number of times. And then as I tried to write about China, as I talked to my Chinese friends, as I saw the return of much of the culture which had been more or less suppressed during the middle of the 20th century, the return of Confucian academies, the return of Buddhist monasteries which were being rebuilt, the return of the Chinese arts of calligraphy and music and painting and so on, I got a sense that there was much more continuity than most people seem to think. And coming from Japan, where I'd had the similar experience of thinking everything was modern and then discovering an underground, secret, parallel world of ancientness, I began to look out for signs of this. And as I read early sources, early missionaries, early accounts of China, and compared their descriptions of the social structure, the mentality, the morality, I saw that there was this great continuity. And it began to dawn on me that although not perhaps as extreme as Japan, there was lying behind the ultra-modern surface of even places like Shenzhen or parts of Shanghai, there was an ancientness, an ancient grammar which had not been expunged. And talking of grammar, one of the obvious clues to this was the language. Although it had been simplified in the middle of the 20th century, and only the full version was maintained in Taiwan, even the simplified grammar was an ancient form of writing. And I was increasingly amazed that in 1/5 of the world, in one super efficient now civilization, they'd maintained what looked to the West as a very inefficient form of writing system, where you had to learn 2,000 different characters, where the grammar was very unstructured, where it was really difficult and very primitive, because this was a form of picture writing, pictographs or logographs. Logo is a word, so each character was a word with various components. And this is the form of writing that was common right across the world until alphabetic, simple systems were devised, which have an entirely different approach. The individual characters have no meaning, but when combined, they form into words and sentences. And the Chinese one seemed extremely inefficient, a fossil surviving from 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. How had this happened? But the fact that it had happened, and that it was the unifying force for China, because all across China, in the many different languages and dialects, one thing was unifying, which was that everyone should be able to write and read a little bit of Mandarin, and so you could go anywhere in China and communicate. That's what held this vast civilization together, rather like the elite knowledge of Roman language in medieval, early modern Europe. And that primitive survival was one little indication of what had happened and what hadn't changed. Another one was the family system. Now, the other basis of much of China was this male-based, tracing males through ancestors, forming into clans, having very strong kin bonds, reinforced by Confucius and others statements about loyalty to parents and so on. That system had, of course, been largely modified both by the reforms of the communist period and more recently, and it wasn't the same as it was in the 19th or 18th centuries, but there was a lot that remained. Talking to my young Chinese friends, their attitudes to their parents and grandparents and to older people were markedly different from my attitudes and my friends and family over here. Far less individualistic, far more loyalty, obedience, deference, a feeling of shared responsibility, much more so than you would find in the Anglosphere. Perhaps more like southern Europe, Italy and Spain, but distinctly different from England and America and so on. So that had been half maintained. Then again, looking at the governmental system, at first it looked as if the whole imperial system, which had collapsed with the formation of the Republic in 1912, meant that the imperial system that had governed China since the first emperor in 221 BC, it looked as if that had disappeared. But then, when you went behind even the present organization of the Chinese Communist Party, it was very, very structurally similar to the imperial system. In other words, you had a very powerful emperor-like figure, the party secretary at the top. You had his very close advisors. In the old days, they would be mandarins, top mandarins, eunuchs, and so on, ruling in the Forbidden City, but now in the Central Party headquarters. And then a series of delegations down through levels of power, down through the great provinces of China, down to the great cities and regions of China, down to the small towns, down to the villages and small communities, 5 layers, and everything going up to the center and everything going down in a pyramid structure, run by extremely well trained on the whole near the top, highly educated, based on educational merit and brilliance, a system of bureaucracy. So imperial bureaucracy of the ancient kind that had held together this vast empire, the size of Eastern and Western Europe and parts of Russia, that imperial bureaucracy continued in another guise to this day, and all attempts to dislodge it and bring in something else have so far been unsuccessful, largely because if you didn't have something like that, with 1.4 billion people spread over that area with many different local variations, the place would fall to pieces. So the bureaucratic, governmental, political system had been maintained. Another thing that had been maintained was the philosophical system, because one of the great differences, as I discovered in Japan and in Nepal even, was the absence of monotheism, no belief in one creating, all-powerful, benevolent God. Instead, you had in Japan all sorts of different forces contending with each other: Buddhism, Confucianism, ancestor worship, Shinto, and so on. And that had actually continued in China, although there were attempts to root out the old, supposedly misleading ideologies of the old world. They still exist. China is still deeply involved in Taoism, in ancestor worship, in Confucianism, and in Buddhism. There are, of course, over 100 million Christians, there are Muslims, there are others. But basically, China is a country, as it has been for thousands of years, with a set of parallel, different ideologies, none of which you can really call a religion in the Western sense. And they have provided the philosophical, moral, ethical, ritual framework for the Chinese, each part providing something different. And that was part of another great difference, one expression of it, which I'd also found in Japan, which was that China had not gone through fully what Jaspers calls the axial age. It had not shifted on its axis to separate off this material, physical world that we live in and a world of force and spirit and qi, as they call it in China, energy and force. That world was clearly still alive. You could see it in Tai Chi, you could see it in Chinese medicine, you could see it in yin and yang, you could see it in the winds and the waters, the feng shui. Everywhere, the Chinese lived, as they did in my little village in Nepal or in Japan, in an enchanted, magical garden, as Weber had put it. And that had not disappeared, and it is one vast difference to the West. Now, of course, they had imported on top of that and alongside it and in pockets much of Western thought and rationality and science and legal systems and so on. And these subsisted apparently quite easily alongside an enchanted and magical world. That element, which you can put in another way and say that basically China has a mentality and morality of a quantum kind, a both and approach to reality, facts and fiction, left and right, this and that, are all interblended. There are no great binary oppositions, and that again is a vast difference to my own experience in the West, where from Greek through Christian up to the present we have lived in a largely confrontational and binary world, whereas in China it feels totally different, and that is one of the great differences which has been maintained. Another continuation of a great difference is in the aesthetic and artistic systems. Putting it very bluntly, the Chinese have never gone through the Renaissance, the Western Renaissance. In other words, they have never separated the eye from the ear. The two, as in their writing system, calligraphy, and in their painting systems, are mixed together, and indeed all their arts and crafts are not separated in the way that they are in the West. So Chinese writing and painting is both writing and painting at the same time. Poetry is enormously important in China, and the arts are highly prized. So China has remained a pre-Raphaelite, a pre-Renaissance aesthetic and artistic system, and that continues to this day. Of course, there are many good modern artists. Of course, the Chinese can, as they showed in their export in art and other things, can paint wonderfully and realistically in the way that Western painters can. But the essence of their art and their aesthetics is not that kind of system. And finally, a big difference, a huge difference, was that I think in terms of individualism, I am as a separate individual I have the whole world within me. I am Robinson Crusoe on his island. Me and God, perhaps, are complete in ourselves. I am an economic, social, political, religious world, and I am set free by my education and by leaving home to be a responsible citizen and ethically and morally and socially and politically and economically a single actor. Now, that basis of my system is totally different from what was traditional in China, and I think is still the case, where you have an embedded system where each individual, where, putting it another way, the group comes first and then the individual hangs off the group. And so what is important in China is not the single entity, the person or whatever it is. It is the relationship between yin and yang, between one individual, between a father and a child, between a man and a woman, the emperor and the assistant. That kind of structural, as they put it in French thought, structural relationship, where it is the relations that matter and not the things in themselves. It is a relation of A to B, which is C, which is really important and not the thing. That has continued in China, and it means that, as I began to discover, the Chinese social structure is in many ways very ancient and very simple. In fact, I was shocked to suddenly realize that the nearest I could think of in the anthropological literature were the very simplest hunter-gatherer groups, as in Australia, as described and analysed, for instance, by Durkheim, where he describes that in these societies they are held together by what he called mechanical solidarity, where you have identical parts in a chain, like an earthworm, certain kinds of earthworm, and if you cut it, the earthworm doesn't die, because each part is part of a related string, and as long as that string is there, it goes on. And this gives the great toughness to the Chinese system. It is more or less indestructible. Whereas, as Durkheim put it, we live in a world of what he calls organic solidarity, meaning where we are like a human body. Each of us has a function within a larger structure. So some of us are the head, some of us are the hand, some of us are the back, and our class and caste systems are based on that principle. Now that is totally different from China. So stepping back and putting it all together, China is the great example of an alternative, parallel world hiding behind, or not hiding behind, but apparently covered over by modernity. And this is why when I started writing about these things, a number of my young Chinese friends had the same reaction as my Japanese friends. They said, "Alan, this is wonderful. It's made me completely rethink myself. I had this sense that there was something wrong in how I was presented as entirely modern and cut off from the past. Now I read some of your writing and your accounts of 19th century French missionaries and so on, and it all makes sense, and it also restores to me what I really realize, that the differences between me and the West and the continuity of my identity over the centuries. And so it is highly liberating, but it is also shocking. It's not something that I had expected to find, and I'm amazed that I find it not from one of my fellow Chinese philosophers or social thinkers, but from a complete outsider who doesn't speak the language and has never seriously been a Chinese scholar. But you seem to have stumbled on things about my civilization which no one I know of in China has seen. So the freshness of an outside eye has given you a vision which I find very helpful, restorative, and making sense of my world. And so that, which also helps me make sense of the great civilization of China, as it did of Japan, is something which I really am enjoying exploring. Ever since I was a child and read Coleridge's Kubla Khan in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree, and felt the magic of China, I have now entered into that magic and can relish a very, very different world which has not been destroyed by the West, not been destroyed by what happened in the terrible turmoil of the middle of the 20th century, but it survives and will survive and will replenish and enrich my world by offering a great alternative, as Japan does, to my way of thinking. It doesn't have to be like our Western trajectory, and it doesn't have to conform to some Western sociological laws. So it's been a wonderful educational experience.